Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Anthony Hinnon, Pennsylvania reporter for the Center Square. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, it's looking like we are having another round of constitutional amendments floating around the General Assembly. What can you tell us here?
For those who may not remember, the constitutional amendment battle has been happening since the beginning of the year. After the House settled its disputes and elected new leaders and kind of organized itself and implemented these all-powerful rules that held up session for months and months. The first thing that they did, as promised, was vote on a constitutional amendment that would open up a 2-year retroactive window for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse to sue their perpetrators. This grew out of a grand jury investigation into the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania back in 2018 that found something like 1,000 children abused by 300 or so priests. From that investigation is where this idea came into existence and into fruition. And it's really been a lightning rod of controversy because we have struggled to get this over the finish line since 2018, even though there's widespread bipartisan agreement. And again, what the House seems to be doing here, although it's moving this closer to the finish line, is it's still mired in controversy. So what happened here is House Bill 1, as it's called, the Statute of Limitations Reform Amendment. They debated it on the floor really like the first or second day that they were back in session. And because they had adopted these new rules that specified that constitutional amendments have to get a public hearing before going to a floor vote, something that, quite frankly, the chamber wasn't going to abide by until, Republicans newly in the minority quickly pointed it out. So in fairness, they referred it back to the Judiciary Committee. At the same time, and take this how you will, interpret as you want, they took a separate Senate bill, which also included this constitutional reform, as well as 2 others, voter ID and reforms to the regulatory process. Democrats hated those. That's part of why they wouldn't agree to rules for months, because they wanted to find a way to make sure those don't get out of committee, don't get on the ballot. So what they did is they stripped those 2 amendments from this Senate bill and left the statute of limitations reform language in. Both of those were voted out of committee this week. So now they're both back on the House floor. Presumably they will approve both of those bills very soon, send them back to the Senate, or send House Bill 1 to the Senate for the first time, send Senate Bill 1 back for concurrence because it's now been amended. The problem here is that the Senate is not going to approve that amended version of their bill. They have not wavered on this fact. They passed it as it was back in January. They've said that Democrats' resistance to putting all 3 of these amendments on the ballot is because they're afraid of, the other 2 getting passed. There's quite a bit of bitterness here, even though they're trying to kind of smooth over it with bipartisanship that I think that we may see quickly disintegrate again. The other thing here is that House Bill 1, however, which will again get support both on the House and has the majority support in the Senate, what they plan to do in the upper chamber with that seems, of the 2, that seems like the more likely path that they're going to take, because realistically, it would be shooting yourself in the foot publicly to say, no, we're not going to pass either constitutional amendment here, given the fact that survivors of this childhood sexual abuse have been waiting for years and have been left behind in this issue for many reasons, the most recent of which was they couldn't agree to rules. But before that, there was an error by the State Department that, missed a statutory deadline, and we were about to have the chance to vote on it in a primary election and lost that chance because of this statutory error. So this has been a really long process. We're, again, somewhat moving on it, but the future of it, how quickly this is going to happen, is there going to be able to be a vote on the November ballot? It's still, I would say 50-50 chance at this point.
Is this something where it's just a lot of this remains up in the air until it isn't? Or do we have an idea of some deadlines here? Is this just going to be further rounds of this back and forth?
It's a fair question. I think some of the guardrails that we have, they can give us some kind of indication of what's going to happen with this maybe in the rest of the year, is that one of the new rules adopted is that constitutional amendments can't go on primary ballots. They have to appear in general election ballots. So that means only in the November elections. So they are going to be coming up against another deadline in order to get this amendment on the ballot by November. I don't know off the top of my head what that deadline is, but if you don't see action probably by the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th, it's not going to happen for this year. Now, the process for constitutional amendments is that you have to pass them. They have to pass both chambers in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. Pennsylvania has 2-year legislative sessions, so it's a fairly lengthy process. And what's important here is that the governor cannot veto a constitutional amendment. Once it's approved, it goes to the ballot, and then voters get to decide yes or no. There can be some debate over the language of the amendments. We've seen that happen in the past where there's been accusations that, for example, the State Department under former Governor Wolf was hostile to the constitutional amendment that would have limited the governor's emergency powers. And so they worded it in a way that was trying to encourage people to vote no. And that didn't change the way that the amendment was worded on the ballot, and it eventually passed by a pretty comfortable majority. So even if they take action on it before the end, before the budget is signed, because that's when I think that you might see something, this kind of deal, it's not going to be the end of the debate. It's not going to be, we're going to keep hearing about this. But I would say, and once they have a budget, if there's no action on this, we're not going to see anything this year.
Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Kristen Smith, this is Anthony Hennon. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.